My name is Paul Lincoln, and I'm the host for Soil Matters, a podcast from the British Society of Soil Science, the professional body for soil scientists in the UK. Welcome to this, our third episode. Soil Matters connects scientific research with practical application. Today, we're discussing the new theories of soils and, linked to this, a call for papers for a special 75th birthday edition of the European Journal of Soil Science. The past few years have seen a huge demand for action on soil health. This has been reflected in the fact that government agencies, nationally and globally, are recognising the importance of monitoring, managing and restoring soil health. This in turn has fueled the rapid development of technologies promising real-time measurements of key soil indicators. However, there is a problem. What we mean by soil health is neither straightforward nor is an issue where there is clear agreement. This problem was addressed in 2022 when the European Journal of Soil Science published a paper called A New Theory for Soil Health. I'm delighted to say that two of the article's authors are with us today in the studio. Professor Jim Harris is Chair of Environmental Technology at Cranfield University, and Dr. Daniel Evans is a lecturer in soil formation, also here at Cranfield University. Welcome to you both. Before we look at the call for papers and the original paper that inspired this work, Jim, tell us what you're doing here at Cranfield.
So, although my title is Chair in Environmental Technology, I focus on systems ecology. And from that, I look at the way in which systems develop resilience, when they lose resilience. And in particular, this then plays out in a variety of fields, from soil through to ecosystem health and restoration. So it's quite a broad topic. I get involved in a lot of different areas.
What inspired you to focus specifically on soil health?
My first degree was in plant biochemistry. And by going to the wrong research office in British Coal, I ended up with a PhD in soil microbiology. And I was looking at the microbiology of soil stored during open cast mining operations. And in those days, it was very much collect a list of, have we got some of this, some of that? What are the numbers of this? What are the numbers of that? And it struck me that, one, we could use that as an indication of soil condition, but more importantly, what happens during the processes after open cast mining to restore systems. And that led me to restoration ecology, which is my real love, and the way in which soil plays out in that arena. And it's still sorely underrepresented.
Thank you. Dan, tell us what you focus on here at Cranfield.
Well, I'm a lecturer in soil formation. I'm interested in how soils form, essentially. And part of that is thinking about the material of soil. So some of my research in the start of my career in soil science has been focusing on the rates at which bedrock weathers into soil. It's those very slow, imperceptible processes, really, that captured my excitement for soil science. More recently, though, and it's working with fantastic people like Jim and colleagues here at Cranfield and beyond, that has got me to think, well, it's not just the material, it's the system of the soil. And as we're probably going to talk about later today, it's the idea of how do you turn a material into something which has system properties. It can function, it can deliver services, it can deliver things that you and I depend on, but also can work in an integrated way and can combat some of the challenges which are confronting it on a daily basis. So that's in a sense, what I'm working on at the moment.
And again, the same question that I asked Jimmy, what inspired you to focus specifically on soil health?
Well, soil health for me is not too far away from thinking about the development of a soil system. Soil health is maybe a shortcut to think about how that soil has developed over time, naturally, how we as humans have impacted that process. And in many ways, how we measure the system properties within a soil. And if we can measure and, detect those properties in a soil, that can give us an understanding about how healthy, shall we say, inverted commas, that particular system is. So I think there is a really interesting sense here. We can go to another planet and say, has that planet got a soil what would we use to answer that question? What metrics would we use? And I think that's where we can think about what actually makes a soil.
Brilliant. Thank you. An excellent starting point. So, Dan, I'll start with you. You have said in the original paper that the term soil health has captured the interest of government and land managers, but the academic community has struggled to rationalise its use and its wider benefit. Just describe to us what's happened.
Well, for me, this concept of soil health is quite straightforward. It's simplistic. It's very easy to communicate. We can go to the doctors and we can ask our doctor, how healthy am I? We think about health on a day-to-day basis, maybe subconsciously, perhaps, maybe very deliberately, but health is it's an easy concept to think and therefore to translate to soils as a resource that we ultimately should care for, just like we would care for our own society, for our own bodies. The problem is, and this is where the challenge has come, particularly from the academic community, is, okay, well, you can ask the doctor, how healthy am I? But the doctor then needs a test, needs some sort of assessment for measuring that health. There is no tool or one assessment they can use to say, okay, Dan, your health is 8 out of 10, your health is 6 out of 10. But that's, in a sense, been the kind of call that's been made or placed upon us from landowners, from governments. They want a single number, or they're aspiring for us to measure soil health with one tool or one assessment. And soils are so much more complex than that. And that's the interesting challenge or conflict between how soil health can be communicated as a notion and how we as scientists can measure that in the field.
So you've talked about the idea of soil health being a powerful tool in conveying best practice to a lay audience. What has been the result of this, do you think?
It is, at the end of the day, a very useful concept. In many ways, soil health is a conversation starter. It allows different people to come into the room and share their experiences and their knowledge, their understanding about the ways in which soils behave in the day-to-day. And I think that tool, that use of soil health as a term to kickstart conversation, well, that's very good. Of course, there are challenges about which, some of those I spoke about. But the fundamental thing is you have to start a conversation with the community. And soil health is a good starter for that, really.
Okay, a good starter. But Jim, is there a problem with the term and should we stop using it?
Okay, well, I'll take that in the two parts that you've given it.
Yeah.
First of all, should we stop using it? No, depending on what sort of audience you're addressing, perhaps, in that, as Dan has said, it's a very useful term to try and encapsulate the concept of you can make soils better or worse. So in that condition, it's certainly not. The real problem is if you do have a room full of people and you say the term soil health, everyone will have their own idea in their mind what that means. Everything from, I know my soils are healthy because I'm getting a good crop from it, but you might be getting a good crop from it simply because you're substituting all the ecological functions with inputs. So the problem is that if we really do want to understand soil health, we first have to investigate and ask ourselves, is soil in fact a system or not?
Okay, so we've got one issue, is soil capable of exhibiting health, which you both touched on? And also, are there other properties emerging from a complex, connected, self-regulating system? Is this the direction that you would like certainly soil scientists to be approaching this?
Absolutely. And I think that this is not confined to soil science. You'll find this in ecosystem science and conservation also. If something is going to exhibit health, then it has to be exhibiting systems characteristics. And we're really interested to see.
And you want to define that?
Yeah. So these are characteristics which you can only determine dynamically. You can't take a snapshot of, say, what the soil organic matter is, pH, and all of the components that exist of. That just tells you the condition at that instant. To understand whether it's a system, you have to take dynamic measurements. So you have to take measurements of soil over a variety of timescales. And this is the exciting bit because we can start with our new technologies to investigate the emerging characteristics of an intact functioning system, which is resilient, And resilience is a great thing to measure because we've got ways in which we can approach that.
You can measure that.
Yeah, we think we've got some various ways of doing it. The question of rolling them out is another issue because that's where we need to get to. The precursor to that is how complex are these systems? And we've got a number of ways of approaching that.
And how would you like your fellow soil scientists to be engaged with this topic?
Many of them are in different ways, but we like to think about what are these levels of organisation and then this dynamic emergent characteristic from it. What's the complexity of this soil? And it's not simply what's happening with the soil microbiome. It's not simply what are the functions that are coming out of this. It's the sort of the complexity of the signals such as volatile organic carbons. There's a good indication of complexity and condition. Profiles of catabolic response. How do these soils respond to different sorts of carbon inputs from simple to complex? How does the soil exhibit structural complexity and the interactions between the different trophic levels? So the first simple question is everything there that you think should be there for a functioning system? Secondly, how are they interacting? Thirdly, how do they interact with one another in the face of perturbation? And that's really what we're trying to get to. Then you've got the practical question of how can I do that in a field situation or remote sensing or something like that. And we are working on different aspects of it.
Because what's the level of awareness and engagement with the topic, specifically around your own academic community?
Okay, so quite a bit of engagement actually, but sometimes people are working on an area without fully realizing that they're part of a bigger picture in the sense of this complexity, emergent property idea. And very often we've still got people who are looking at particular smaller parts of the system, which is great because we need to know all of this. Others are more looking at a sort of a systems level response. And I think that there's a growing awareness that we need to nail this if we're going to make some very serious decisions about how we manage soils and their roles in ecosystems and agricultural systems in a very challenging and fast-changing environment.
Now, the original article was published in 2022. What was the response to that?
The response was, as you might expect, mixed. There was some excitement from the community that for the first time in a succinct way, we had developed this quite elegant solution perhaps to quite a complex topic. So I think from the community, there was excitement about the potential. Obviously, there were clearly the follow-up questions. Well, how do you actually put this theory of soil health to the test? You know, any great theory's value is surely tested by its ability to be tested and assessed in the environment. And therefore, the questions we were receiving, the responses that we were receiving from the soils community was, okay, well, that's great. Harris et al., you've got this wonderful theory. What actual measurements do I do? Going back to our, GP in the surgery, what tests do they do to turn this theory into life? And you see, much of the community is still going out with a bucket and spade, quite literally, and digging a little sample of soil here and digging a little sample of soil there, perhaps at one point in an experiment. Some will be probing the soils at different depths with little probes, and these magic wands, in a sense, bring out these values which don't really mean too much for our long-term understanding of the soil system, as Jim has explained. So that's the response that we received. And I think we've regrouped since then to think about, okay, well, we've got this theory. How do we go the next step? How do we take this into some kind of practical realization?
So this is clearly linked to your decision to put together a special edition of the journal.
Indeed.
And happily, it also links to the 75th birthday of the journal. So it's very much a special edition. What made you decide that it was worth the whole journal, if I can put it that way?
Well, I think it's a real match made in heaven in many ways, because the journal is celebrating its anniversary. It's 75 years since the inception of the journal. And you see, scientists have been contributing evidence, knowledge, understanding to all of these different ways we understand the soils in this new theory, the signs of life in a soil, the signs of function, the signs of connectivity, the signs of emergence, as Jim has described. Scientists have been doing this for years and been publishing in the European Journal of Soil Science, obviously not exclusively, for many years. And so I think this special issue really celebrates the work that has been contributed to the journal to this point. But also, we're asking the community to think about soils the way that they've understood soils in a slightly different kind of way, rather than thinking, okay, I'm a soil microbiologist. I'm only going to focus on the microbiological elements of a soil. We're now asking them to think more holistically. How does your work integrate with this person over here who's thinking about the functioning of a soil system and the connectivity of a soil system? And then this person over there that's working on the resilience, the emerging properties of a soil system. And so working holistically like this and kind of physically putting this into a special issue not only celebrates the work in soil science, but also gets us to think about soil systems and soil health in a brand new way.
And will you also take the opportunity to review the past 75 years worth of articles and write about that?
Of course.
Excellent. So someone will read through the whole lot.
Well, we can't read through every article, but there are ways in which we can synthesize the trends and the patterns. I'm a fairly young soil scientist, shall we say. I mean, not comparing myself to anyone across the podcast table here, but we all have our own, in a sense, understanding of how soil system has developed, has evolved over time. And in our respective fields, we've seen patterns emerge, trends emerge, and collating all of those ideas together, we've got a sense of how soil science as a discipline has evolved over time in the time that the European Journal of Soil Science has been championing some of that research. So in many ways, collectively, as a group of guest editors, we can start to think about where we are right now, what has gone before us, how do we get here, in other words, and also looking ahead to the future, to the next 25 years, to that kind of centennial anniversary of the journal. Where do we want to be in 25 years' time to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the journal?
So this is rather more than just a celebration. This is an opportunity to analyse, to take stock and to plan ahead. You said at the beginning that it was useful to kick off a conversation by using the phrase soil health. Just in terms of this call for people to contribute to this special edition, to what extent do you want to ask people to look still at definitions of the word health? Is that useful? Or has the conversation been kicked off already?
Well, yeah, the conversation was kicked off decades ago. This is an issue which in many ways punctuates a long-standing conversation. It's a comma, in a sense, rather than the start of a new paragraph, because we do want to celebrate the really hard efforts of soil scientists that have come before us. So yes, we're turning a new direction. We're pivoting towards this idea of soil systems, this new theory that we've launched a couple of years ago. But we do want to connect it to the work that has been done to this point. And so the conversation's kicked off. Do we want scientists to gather all of their dictionaries and start to pull apart the definition of soil health? Perhaps not. We're not compelling them to do that. We're wanting them to engage with this more interesting, I think more exciting aspect, which is a soil a system? How do we detect system properties in soils, and how do we go about that in our day-to-day roles as scientists, but also as practitioners and as policymakers?
Now, I think that's a really helpful note about the focus on the use of language. Isn't there also at the moment, and it's particularly topical because there's a big debate about AI and copyright being debated in the House of Lords, is there also not a very big issue about the power of disruptive technologies in the management of soils that needs to be considered alongside this?
Yes, there is a great place right now for that kind of discussion. We have to remember, of course, that we can go back to the very basics and establish a theory for soil science, for soil systems, but we need some way of being able to detect those system properties. And, as Jim described earlier, this idea that right now, we have the technologies, we've developed the methods, the tools that are starting to get us to explore those in new and interesting ways. So, just one example, the ways in which we're able to establish the life within a soil now is transformed more than it ever has been by pulling lots of researchers both within and beyond soil science together. We're understanding the soils in completely new ways. We wouldn't have been able to do that, say, 25, 30 years ago. And so there is a need and a great agency for those technologies to help us in understand the soils. We're not just using the tools because, they're shiny and they're lots of interesting data coming out of them and we just want to create data for data's sake. No, we want to use the technologies to answer really fundamental questions about our understanding of the soil system.
Brilliant. Thank you. And there's a final question, if I can ask you, Jim. You've said that you're very keen to invite collaboration from a wide range of disciplines outside of the world of soil science. Just give us some examples of how that might take place.
So we'd like to hear from anyone who thinks about systems, be they philosophers, physicists, chemists, ecologists in particular, technologists who might have something to say about how you determine the function of complex systems, engineers who work on complex systems all the time. Because I think in the end, we need to know not only what the technical aspects of what we can do, the more ecological aspects of the way that these fit into the wider world of the functioning of our planetary system. We also need to make sure that we've got our ethical background properly laid out and our philosophy of, is what we're doing really logical? Can you defend it? And I've worked with logisticians in the field of restoration ecology, and sometimes you have to sit back and think, blimey, I hadn't thought of that. Because I think in the end, what we're really after is sort of one of the outputs of this might be the equivalent of Mr. Spock's tricorder. Right. That he runs over a planet and says, it's life, Jim, but not as we know it. But it will give you a summary of what's going on. So if we can get all of those things together, we really would like to hear from people who've got something to say about the concept of soil health, complexity, systems, emergent properties, particularly resilience.
Brilliant. Well, it's worth reminding people that there's still time to submit your ideas. The deadline for submission is the 31st of July this year. So please send your proposals to the editor of the journal. So Dan and Jim, many thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next guest today is Dan Lambeth, who is a trustee of the British Society of Soil Science. Dan, welcome. You joined the BSSS as a trustee about 3.5 years ago. Your focus is on marketing, communications and policy. Tell us a bit about your work in that area.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, as a trustee of the organisation, my responsibility is to oversee the good governance of the organisation and its financial sustainability. But each of us around the table have specialisms, and mine is on the policy side. So I'm particularly focused on thinking about how the organisation can translate its aims, objectives and findings into language and narrative that's meaningful for the rest of society.
Now, you've worked for JP Morgan, for the Royal Bank of Scotland, the London Stock Exchange and the Treasury. And one of your key areas of interest, as you've already said, has been in the management and reporting of sustainability. Say a bit more about how you are and will apply this experience to BSSS.
We've seen this revolution in terms of the interest in the private sector in sustainability. So when I started my career 25 years ago, the notion that a bank would be interested, for example, in soil health was laughable. But we now have trading and investment desks that are focused on building funds and investment vehicles around all sorts of different sustainability themes, including soil health. So there is the appetite there to build these funds and vehicles, but there's a lot of questions about the reliability of the data that investors are using in order to make decisions. And so there's been a big drive across the industry working in partnership with organizations like the Society to identify data sets and targets which are scientifically robust.
And do you think that those systems are in place, or do you think there's a long way to go before someone in your position can recommend with reliability that those systems are working?
I think there's still some way to go, but the progress that's been made in the last 10 years is remarkable. And that owes a lot actually to that partnership between academics, governments and investors. And there've been some very interesting developments. I mean, not just in terms of global standard setting, for example, in relation to climate mitigation and adaptation, but some really interesting developments around specific data sets that investors are using to make decisions. For example, in relation to biodiversity farming, believe it or not, there are biodiversity funds in which investors can invest and support their ecological and other objectives, as well as make a return.
Now, you've heard the earlier discussion, and one of the comments that was made was that the term soil health has captured the interest of government and land managers, but that the academic community has struggled to rationalise its use and wider benefit. So, speaking maybe generally, how significant do you think there is this division between government and land managers on the one hand and academics on the other?
Yeah, I think that it's a problem not just for the Soil Society. So I think all academics and specialist groups struggle to communicate aims, objectives and findings, because they're often using quite complex concepts and data that don't immediately translate in terms of the narrative that's used by other groups. And I think that reflects actually different functions and objectives, knowledge building versus complex policy decision making and production, I think, aren't always fully aligned. And therefore, I think, firstly, I think we have to accept that these groups are coming from different perspectives, that actually, in order for them all to achieve their objectives, singing from the same hymn sheet, if I can put it that way, is absolutely key. So building those bridges between the groups that enable them all to move in the same direction. And if they don't, I think that the risk for groups like the Society is that the science gets left behind and decisions get made that aren't based on robust.
Yes, because I was going to ask you, what do you think of the implications of this kind of division for soil scientists?
I often get quite irritated in terms of these divisions, because my entire career has been about circumnavigating them.
Yeah.
So even when I was in financial services, my role was to help banks and capital market infrastructure to speak in a meaningful way to the rest of the world. This is why we're here. This is what we're trying to achieve. This is why we want the rules to change. So I don't really believe in these clear lines between each of the groups. I think they're all deeply interconnected. I think that for academics, there is, and I'm also, I should say, incidentally, in the process of completing a DPhil, so I understand the challenge. There's a very difficult balancing act for academics, because on the one hand, presumably, I'm assuming that you go into soil science because you want to make a difference. And yet at the same time, you need to maintain your academic integrity. It's a very, very difficult balancing act, I think. But when managed properly, I think can have a big impact on the world around scientists.
That's really interesting. In the earlier discussion, we talked about the use of language in understanding the notion of health. We're also faced with very disruptive technologies in academia as well as in wider society. How do you think we should think about those issues in terms of the work that you're doing?
I mean, it was fascinating to listen to the previous conversation, because these technologies have the ability to transform our understanding of the soil and ecosystems, and the work that the members that I serve do is incredibly complex, and so provides them with the opportunity, as was explained previously, to give us insights that we've never had before. But I think that, and this is true for AI across all sectors, what you get out is only as good as what you put in. And therefore, I think that leaves the society with, and its members with an obligation to make sure that the data sets that are going in to these technologies are robust and reliable, so that the results of the use of this technology, you can serve a genuine purpose and aren't just used maybe by those other groups, to influence outcomes.
So if we separate the land management and the scientific aspects of the work of BSSS, how do you think land managers should be equipping themselves to understanding the implications and potential benefits of AI?
I think that they should see it as another tool, but that the technology doesn't replace the role of professional judgment. And that again is true for all sectors. I qualified in my early career as a lawyer, and there's a lot of debate about whether AI will replace lawyers, and it never will, because ultimately at the end of the day, you need that judgment check and the application of critical judgment. So I think that, look, AI can do an awful lot for land managers in all sorts of different ways, from soil moisture and integrating weather and climate conditions into assessments. But at the end of the day, those land managers need to be applying their own professional judgment, which is underpinned by sound science.
And then looking specifically at soil scientists, same question, how should they be making the most of AI, do you think?
Possibly the best answer to that question is the webinar the Society led with a couple of academics looking at the use of AI. But I think, in essence, again, it's almost the same answer as the one for the land managers, in the sense that it's another tool and it's another capability, but will never replace the work of the scientists.
I'm interested in discussing the issue of marketing and copyright. As I said earlier, this is being debated in the House of Lords, and there's been a lot of lobbying from people, particularly in the creative industries, about fears that copyright will be overwhelmed by the demands of AI. So looking outside of this professional body, what do you think soil scientists can learn from the work of other practitioners who are, in fact, the legal profession is an obvious one, I think, but other practitioners, to look, what can they learn from outside of this?
There's two questions and two answers. So the first is, does communication really matter? And I believe, yes, it's actually critical. My role as a trustee is to ask the awkward questions in a constructive and friendly way, and occasionally, I'm prompted to ask around the table, why are you doing this work? Is it just for the pure joy of soil? Which, believe it or not, was a term I used in my interview. I'm a keen gardener, and I love soil. Is it just for the joy of the academic enterprise, or do you really want to effect change in the world around you? And if you want to do that, then you have to be able to communicate effectively, both to governments and land managers. And therefore, you do really need to invest in the language that you use and the way you choose to communicate and who you choose to communicate with. That's why companies pay communication agencies vast sums of money in order to get the message right, because they understand the power and the value of communication. So I think it's important for scientists to think about that too. On the copyright side, I have been very anxious right from the beginning of my tenure about how do we protect the incredible work of the members that we serve. I think I asked practically every other meeting, this journal and all this amazing data, can we protect and commercialize it? And I think that AI does present enormous opportunities, but I think that there are also risks and threats there to the autonomy of the work that's being done by scientists, but also, quite frankly, making sure that the right people are recompensed for the work that's undertaken. And so it's a tricky question how you use copyright or other legal means in order to protect your work, but it's worthy of very serious consideration.
So how well do you think we are communicating the value of soil as well as soil health to policymakers and a wider public?
I think that the quality of the communication has improved considerably over recent years. And it's been great to see some of the developments in society and the work that's being done externally with a number of different stakeholders. I was just talking with a member of staff who was referencing Climate Week coming up and in London and thinking about, well, how should we position ourselves and, what will the message be? And I know that society has also played, an important role in COPs and so forth. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I think that over time, I'd like to see an increasing focus on the effectiveness of the communication across different stakeholder groups, how we tailor the communication, and also thinking about how we protect the fruit of the work of the scientists that we serve.
Just a few weeks ago, we saw the very first exhibition on soil, which took place at London's Somerset House. Mm-hmm. So my question is, I'm not sure if it's a fair question, but what's the next big breakthrough that you'd like to see in communicating this topic to a wider public?
Well, two answers. Firstly, for soil to become a legitimate cultural asset. So having worked in sustainable investment for a number of years, you see so many pictures of trees and forests and water, and I would like to see soil more a part of the national conversation.
And what's your definition of a cultural asset?
Something that's widely used as a symbol of a healthy planet.
Brilliant. Okay. And any other communication breakthrough that you'd like?
The other thing that I'd like to see, maybe pushing the boundaries of the definition of communication, but I would like to see over time, and it will take a long time, but I'd like to see greater partnerships between soil scientists and the investment community, and the use of more of the data of soil scientists to better inform the decisions that investors are taking around sustainability.
And one thing I'm very interested to ask you as a final question, I mean, clearly, politically, both in the States and in this country, there's now quite a kickback against even discussing sustainability or dealing with climate emergency. And yet what you've already touched on is that in the private sector, there is massive investment in this. Do you think we could reach a point where, in a way, the private sector is the lead on this, regardless of what any particular government says about these topics?
Well, the numbers speak for themselves. So if you look at investment in things like the climate challenge, much of the funding comes from the private sector. Governments don't have the balance sheet to fix this on their own. And I think that certainly in Europe, a lot of the frameworks and the regulation are already in place to continue driving capital into sustainable investments. I do think, though, that it is a different story. Europe's in a very different position from the US at the moment, and it's much easier to operate in the sustainability field in Europe than in the US.
And to what extent have you noticed the domestic banking system taking on this topic in terms of what they can offer potential domestic investors?
I conceive of the UK as sitting in between the EU and the US. So I think that it's the EU that's really taken the lead in terms of pushing the banking sector into more sustainable financing and investment. I think there's certainly been a lot of progress in the UK, but debate actually about how you make those frameworks maybe friendlier to investors than in the EU, where the regulatory framework's very sure. Complex indeed. But we are, I think, in many ways miles ahead of the US.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you very much for talking about the joy of soil. I think this could be a great name for a podcast. Dan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our final guest today is Jenny Dungate, who is the editor of the European Journal of Soil Science. Jenny, welcome.
Hi, Paul.
We've already said that this is the European Journal of Soil Science's 75th anniversary year. Tell us a bit about the history of the journal.
Well, the EJSS used to be called the Journal of Soil Science. It was established in 1949, and it fulfilled the ESQ's original mission to publish an annual publication. The change of title to the European Journal of Soil Science happened in 1994, and that was following a decision made by the Council of the IUSS. So now we're in 2025, and we're into publishing volume 76. And as ever, there are 6 issues a year that are published bi-monthly.
And we've been discussing a range of topics that have been at the heart of the journal. What's the best way of summarising the journal's mission?
The simplest description is that we publish papers about any aspect of soil science research, but it must provide novel insights into soil processes and be of international relevance. And actually, as part of the 75th anniversary, we reviewed and simplified the mission. European Journal of Soil Science is an international journal dedicated to advancing the theoretical and mechanistic understanding of soil properties and processes from molecular to global scales in natural and managed environments through measurement and modelling.
And why is that mission important, do you think?
Well, as far as we know, we're the only planet with soil on it. And that's, I assume, why it's called Earth. So we need to understand as much as possible about this amazing resource, because our lives and that of most other species depend on it. And from a purely human perspective, soils are crucial for tackling many contemporary societal challenges, particularly to address the global challenges of the Anthropocene, which are basically bad effects that humans have had on the globe. So much of the funding for soil science research at the moment is focused on that, so the human impact on soils. So many of the papers which end up being published in the EJSS are driven by this increasing recognition at the highest government level that soils are actually the foundation of society, which is why the concept of soil health, as you were talking about earlier, has gained such momentum.
What do you think have been the key trends over the period that you've been editor of the journal over the past few years?
So I've been editor-in-chief for, it'll be 7 years at the end of this year. I've definitely seen and very much enjoyed watching the novel technologies to measure and map soils from the scales right from the nanoscale, if you like, the soil pore, at the scale of the bacteria that live in soils, and below to the global scale with satellites and remote sensing and that sort of thing. So these are all focusing on perennial themes in soil science, including soil organic matter and carbon, nutrient cycling, so nitrogen and phosphorus, soil structure and hydrology. But it's really, I think the last couple of decades has been particularly exciting because of the emergence of soil biology as a key theme in soil science research, obviously encouraged by things like, the use of metagenomics, microbiome research and that sort of thing. We now understand, and I don't think we have before, that soils are a living, functioning ecosystem that drives soil functions. We're definitely seeing an increase now in the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to model large data sets, such as those produced by remote sensing technologies. And we have our 75th anniversary Russell Review was actually about the role of AI in soil science over the past decades, written by Alexandra Wadu. And I would say if there's anything which is sort of up and coming, it would be the most recent trend about to thinking about the role of urban soils and their importance. So that to me is the change over the time I've been in the role.
I'm really interested in the issue of urban soils because just over this period, the government is talking in its spending review about a massive investment in house building, and clearly that literally has an impact on the soil. In terms of thinking about soil and soil science, what do you think makes the understanding of urban soils so particular and distinctive?
Well, I think because most of the global population is either in or going to end up in an urban environment. The soils in urban environments have been thought really of as a geotechnical resource to build on, but the quality of life of human beings and all the other species which live in urban or share our urban environments relies very much on green spaces. And there are other things people are getting interested in, like where their food comes from. Can they produce food in their own backyards, as it were? Community spaces, how to share them, and the resource that soils kind of give to holding urban communities together.
It's really interesting because a lot of green campaigns have objected to the planning bill that the government has put together on the grounds that it will be anti-nature. Although the soil lobby hasn't been heard particularly on this, do you think there is a particular argument for saying that urban soils ought to be part of the debate about what it means to bring nature into the city?
Oh, always. Soil should be at the centre of every debate. Don't you realise that, Paul?
Okay, no, that's for you to say, not for me to say, but that absolutely.
Well, joking aside, from the ecosystem service benefit aspect, yes, soils are a function of soil is to build our dwellings on. That's what we use it for. But there are all the other things that we get from soils that contribute to our well-being. And they do need to be accommodated in planning for the environments that we're going to dwell in. If we can do that in advance of moving into that environment, if it's unavoidable, then of course soils are absolutely key, should be thought of as a key resource.
And over the earlier part of this discussion, we've talked specifically about the call for papers on a new theory of soil health. In terms of key themes over the next 3 to 4 years, what would you like to highlight?
Well, in a way, it's not really up to, even though we're interested in the strategy, it's really up to the authors to drive what they want. It's their funders who actually drive the agenda of the research that's funded that comes out at the end of it that we publish. So in that way, we can't really predict what the next few years are going to hold. I'd imagine that AI and machine learning and the implications of that, the opportunities, the threats, will continue to grow. Of course, the new soil laws across Europe and other parts of the world will focus funding onto research which is looking at the outputs of the investment of governments into these soil laws. So we've been involved for the last few years in publishing the outputs of the European Joint Programme on Soils. We're now on our third volume, which has been publishing initially surveys of what's needed across Europe, and then outputs of research, which was looking into the outputs of those surveys. And now we're in our third volume of research output, publishing research outputs. The next stage will be the implementation of the law laws to look after soils, and whether that's actually having an effect or not. So I expect that to be a large component of, is government investment in soil research or soil law legislation going to have outputs that are worth taxpayers' money, I suppose. Ultimately, that's where the funding for research comes from, and that's what we expect the papers of the next few years will entail. But there are always curiosity-driven papers, which are super interesting, but we can't plan for those at all.
Okay, I love the idea of a curiosity-driven paper. And if people are curious and they do want to publish, how should they submit their ideas?
Well, I mean, we, as a senior editorial team and I as editor-in-chief, are always pleased to hear from authors who want to share their ideas. You can also show up at our Meet the Editors occasions at most of the big soils meetings. This year, we will be at Rhizosphere 9. Our president, Paul Hallett, will be there. You can go and have a chat with him. We're also going to be at Eurosoil. We're running special issues at both of those events. But I would suggest very strongly that if authors do have an idea, perhaps they would look at whether their idea fits with our aims and scope, and perhaps read the guidance for authors and maybe a few of the excellent papers we've already published to get an idea of what we publish. And if you have a completely new idea that's really out there and you want to test it in the soil science community, you could always consider contributing an opinion article. But that must be based on sound science, of course, because our reputation at the EJSS is all about reliable, evidence-based, robustly peer-reviewed soil science.
Brilliant. A perfect point at which to end. Jenny, thank you very much for that. And thanks to everyone for listening to this month's edition of Soil Matters. Subscribe on Spotify, Acast and Apple Podcasts to make sure that you hear the next episode as soon as it's uploaded. If you'd like to follow up on any of the topics that we've discussed today, go to the podcast pages of the BSSS website. And to learn more about our 2 journals, to become a member, or discover more about the British Society of Soil Science, visit the website at www.soils.org.uk. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Professor Jack Hannam, and I'm a soil scientist. and I'm past president of the British Society of Soil Science. Did you know the health of our soil affects everything? Our food, our climate, our health, and our future. Formed in 1947, the British Society of Soil Science is a professional membership body dedicated to protecting, improving, and discovering new knowledge about the foundation of our planet, soil. From developing cutting-edge research, engaging with international and domestic governments through science-led policy and advocacy, to publishing in leading sector journals, and accessing extensive educational resources, our members are given the tools to be at the forefront of shaping a sustainable future. Our members are central to making a real impact and facilitating lasting change. Through access to our extensive networks, they can connect with experts and drive the conversation on soil health worldwide. Join a passionate community committed to tackling the future generational climate, biodiversity and food security challenges. Don't wait, get involved today, because soil is where it all begins, and soil matters now more than ever. Find out more at soils.org.uk.